Hi, thank you for joining me in the Louie file. Today we're going to be in Deuteronomy chapter 8. I think we're going to attempt to walk our way through this whole chapter. I have no real pre-planned points to be made with this. I just think that it's something good that we at any time to look at, and it's obviously in Deuteronomy, so it's obviously addressing Israel. But this is talking about how God dealt with Israel and their path to the promised land, and then it's sort of a prediction or a prophecy, I guess you might say, as to what's going to happen if you don't do things the way I'm telling you to do them. Now, I want to state this on the front end. Yes, this is talking about God's relationship with Israel, and there's some people that want to make the argument or make the case that this doesn't necessarily mean that God, I put it this way, I heard it said this way one time. Is there any reason to believe that God has a covenant or connection or relationship or whatever to the United States in the same way that he had with Israel? So in other words, can we take what God did and said with Israel and just lay it right on top of his dealings with the United States? Well, I'm not really trying to answer that question, but what I am trying to do here is I want you to see that how else are we going to know who God is and how he does things if we don't look and dig them out from how he did it with Israel? This is how we get to know who he is. And we also can see ourselves in the behavior or misbehavior, if you will, with Israel. So, I'm going to probably read this, and for the most part, it's self-explanatory, so you can just see yourself in this, see the United States in this, see any country in it, for that matter, in their dealings with God. So, Deuteronomy chapter 8, starting in verse 1. He says, "All the commandments that I am commanding you today you shall be careful to do, that you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land which the Lord swore to give to your forefathers." So this is Moses telling them, look, this is the way it is. God has promised to give this to you, and that you'll live and multiply there based on what he told your forefathers. So look at verse 2. This one is a good one. "You shall remember all the way which the Lord your God has led you in the wilderness these 40 years, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not." So he's saying, look, God made a promise to your forefathers about this promised land, and you're gonna go in there and you're gonna have this promise fulfilled in you. But you can't forget the way that God has led you to this promise. He led you in the wilderness for 40 years, it says, that he might humble you. So in other words, when it comes to dry and tough times in your life, if you're seeking God, if you're living up to what he's called you to live up to, the best way you understand it anyway, we have to see this as a discipline, a testing, a trial, but that doesn't negate or shut down the promise. We're looking toward this promise, and we're believing and know that this promise is going to take place. It's going to manifest. It may be hot and dry right now, but it shouldn't remove the hope or the faith we have in the promise. In fact, it should humble us. And it says here to test us, to know what was in your heart. So God's like, I'm going to put them through this because here's what I think. A mature person gets to walk in freedom. A person that has got self-control. A person that lives upright. A person that gets up in the morning and goes to work, and they don't need somebody calling them and shaking them and reminding them all the time, and patting them on the back and making everything soft and fuzzy for them all the time. It's the person that gets up and goes even when they don't feel like it. It's the person that keeps his face steadfastly toward the goal. So the children of Israel are going through a tough time in the wilderness, but God's plan was to humble them and to bring out what was really in them. You know, and if you remember the story, there's several occasions where they cry about, it's hot, and I'm thirsty, and I'm hungry, and I'm tired, just like little children in the back of the car. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? God sent fiery serpents among them at one point. You know, God has a way of bringing enemies to discipline Israel. There's all sorts of things that happen when we grumble, complain, and fail to grow up and fail to be grateful. So Deuteronomy 8:3, he says, He humbled you and let you be hungry, and fed you with manna which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that He might make you understand that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by everything that proceeds out of the mouth of the Lord. So stuff, physical stuff, even food, is not what sustains us. It's God Himself and His promises and His Word. It's who He is. That's what keeps us going. That's what feeds us on a real deep inner man level. That's what gives us life, hope, right? So sometimes we have to be stripped of all the comforts and all the things we think are life-giving in order to come to the real well of living water, which is God Himself, Christ in our case. Of course, we're in the Old Covenant right now, but it's really pointing to Christ. He is our very life. And we don't just live by material things or even just physical material food. You know, Jesus fed 5,000 plus people in the New Testament, and a whole bunch of them followed around and hunted Him down the next day. And He said, "You're just following me because I fed you." And He says, "Don't work for food or meat that perishes, but that which lasts for eternal life." So He's trying to get them to see a sandwich is good. I mean, your physical body needs nourishment, but your inner spirit man is the one that really is your life, and He's the one that really needs words of life. And they only come from the mouth of God, mouth of the Lord. Deuteronomy 8:4, Your clothing did not wear out on you, nor did your foot swell these 40 years. Thus you are to know in your heart that the Lord your God was disciplining you, just as a man disciplines his son. Therefore you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God, to walk in His ways and to fear Him. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and springs, flowing forth in valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive oil and honey, a land where you will eat food without scarcity, in which you will not lack anything, a land whose stones are iron, and out of whose hills you can dig copper. When you have eaten and are satisfied, you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land which He's given you. So this is a promised land. In other words, this is something God is promising. This is not something that they can earn. This is purely based on God's promise to Abraham and his seed or descendants, in the physical sense, Israel. So He's telling them, look, do what God tells you to do, and walk in His ways and fear Him. Because you're about to come into something amazing, something that you couldn't come up with. You can't make streams run. You can't do that. You're not the one that put the iron in the stones or copper in the hills. You're not the one that did that. Your Creator has done that, and He's promised to give it to you. So just be humble, be thankful, and remember who you are in comparison to who He is. And don't forget to bless the Lord. Thank the Lord for the good land in which He's given you. So look at Deuteronomy 8:11. Beware that you do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping His commandments and His ordinances and His statutes, which I'm commanding you today. So here's a warning. Otherwise, when you have eaten and are satisfied and have built good houses and lived in them, and when your herds and your flocks multiply, and your silver and gold multiply, and all that you have multiplies, then your heart will become proud. And you will forget the Lord your God who brought you out from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You're going to forget Him. Don't start thinking that you're the one that made you wealthy, and you're the one that has done all these great and wonderful things. You're not the one. He's the one that's done it. He's the one that causes our money to multiply and our health to keep going every day. And it can go just in 2 seconds. It can go away quickly. It can go away because a disease, a virus sweeps through, a plague, if you will. It can go away if a foreign enemy decides to run up on our shore and God just lifts His protective hand. if he's not the keeper, then we're in trouble, because then we're forced to keep ourselves. And I don't know about you, but I've already discovered I can't keep myself. I spent a lot of years in the wilderness, in the hot and the dryness, because of choices I made, because I was blessed. I've always been a blessed person. I had my own business when I was 19 years old, and I managed to keep it for about 12 years, but it led to a raging addiction. It led to my wife leaving. It led to me burying many friends. It led to me losing that business, and it led to a feeling of powerlessness and hopelessness that was the greatest thing I ever could have come upon. It led me to find out that I had zero power to overcome myself, my addictions, and to care for myself. And then it caused me to look up, and it caused me to look to God and say, you know what? I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. I was drawn in and forced to look to Him. There's a verse in one of the Psalms. I think it's Psalm 139, verse 4. I think he says, "You have hemmed me in before and behind," or behind and before, whichever way. "You've hemmed me in, and you've laid your hand upon me." That's the way God does it. He tends to hem us in. All we have to do is just remember who He is. Be thankful, be humble, and grateful for who He is. That's what He's looking for, a grateful heart, a thankful heart. Someone that realizes that they didn't make themselves wealthy. And I'm going to go ahead and just say it. If you're not following what I'm getting at here, the United States, just like every other country, because it's full of people that become arrogant and proud about how great they are. We got to know where these blessings come from, because our heart will get proud. We'll forget the Lord that brought us out. Deuteronomy 8:15. He led you through the great and terrible wilderness with its fiery serpents and scorpions and thirsty ground where there was no water. He brought water for you out of a rock of flint. He's provided for you over and over. He's protected you. In the wilderness, He fed you with manna, which your fathers did not know. Listen to this. That He might humble you, and that He might test you to do good for you in the end. Otherwise, you may say in your heart, "My power and the strength of my hand made me this wealth." But you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is He who is giving you power to make wealth, that He may confirm His covenant with which He swore to your fathers, as it is this day. It shall come about, if you ever forget the Lord your God and go after other gods and serve them and worship them, I testify against you today that you will surely perish. Like the nations that the Lord makes to perish before you, so you shall perish, because you would not listen to the voice of the Lord your God. Oh my gosh. Nations have arisen and they have fallen. They have raised up and they have fallen over and over again because of arrogance and pride, and thinking that they did this. My own strength and power and my intellect and my money and my popularity has gotten me today. I'm a self-made man. I've done all this on my own. That is very dangerous. There's a story in Daniel about a king named Nebuchadnezzar, and he was walking around on his palace one day looking at Babylon, and he says, this is my city, this is my kingdom, I built this. It wasn't very long before he was out in the field somewhere grazing like a cow, and his hair grew long and his fingernails, and he became like a beast. Until finally, many years later, he admitted, Lord, you're God. And he was back in his right mind again. And God restored his mind and gave him favor again. And he recognized who God was, and it wasn't him. What this is telling us here in Deuteronomy is that although God promised all these things to Israel, and they were special people, and they are, I think, even today, special people to God Himself, they are not exempt from being judged or being disciplined by God. He's going to treat them the same way. If they get arrogant and proud, then He's going to show them that. And there's several stories throughout the Old Testament where they didn't do what He told them to do. They got into idol worship, and they didn't let the land rest for the Sabbath keeping, the Sabbath days that they were supposed to. So at one point He sent Babylon in there, and they literally took the bulk of the people out as captives back to Babylon. And you know what? It was for 70 years. You know why it was 70 years? Well, one of the reasons was because that's how many years they had failed to let the land rest. So God says, okay, so you're not going to let the land rest, so I will make a way for the land to rest, because I will remove you from that land for as long as it takes. See, God has a way of getting things done when He wants to get them done. And we can either obediently do them, humbly saying, yes, Lord, I believe you and I'll do what you tell me. Or we can do it the hard way and we can be forced out or forced in, depending on the specific situation. But I want to point out two main points here. Again, I want to reiterate. Deuteronomy 8:2, he says, you shall remember all the way which the Lord your God has led you in the wilderness these 40 years. I don't ever want to forget, I had 15 years of addiction, what I would call wilderness years. I don't ever want to forget that. It was dark. It was hopeless. It was fearful. It was depressing. I don't ever want to forget that. I want to always know that He's brought me out of that. And He did humble me, and He tested me. I don't want to become arrogant. I don't want to start thinking that I conquered addiction, because I didn't. Just like Israel had to be freed and brought out, they had to be released, they had to be rescued from Pharaoh and slavery. I too had to be rescued from addiction. All of us have to be rescued out of sin, the slavery of sin. Don't ever forget that. And that reveals to us what's in our heart. And you know what? Now we want to do what God's called us to do. And then in Deuteronomy 8, verse 16, he says, in the wilderness He fed you manna which your fathers did not know. And then He tells us why, that He might humble you. See, sometimes He gives us a meek living, a small living. You know, we might not make minimum wage. You know, I had to work jobs that, I had to work 2 and 3 little jobs that didn't pay much. Each one of them didn't pay much at all. I helped trim trees and haul brush. I delivered newspapers. I worked at a factory. Whatever it takes. But you know, it's things I don't know that I would have been willing to do until I realized this is what I have to do. I have to do whatever I have to do. So God gave Israel manna, and they didn't really like it so much. But they had to learn that God was going to provide. And they're thinking, well, why didn't they provide steak? Well, He did provide quail at one point when they were fussing about it. He said, oh, you want quail, do you? So He gave them so much quail that it was coming out of their nose. He made them sick. And then I think they might have been a little more welcoming to the manna then. You know, we can live on a whole lot less normally than what we're living on. Now I'm just speaking to people that I know directly in the United States, because even what we might think of as poorest people in the United States are very wealthy, well-fed compared to most of the world. So he says that he humbled them and tested them, in other words, to do good for them in the end. You see, He was not going to allow arrogant, prideful, unbelieving people into His promised land. So what happens is He's training and teaching them through the wilderness, the hot, dry places of having very little or next to nothing of their own, was to teach them, I think, a couple of things. One is you can get by on a whole lot less than you generally do. I know that's what I've discovered. Back in my dark desert days, when I didn't have any income, I used to think, well, what do I need? Well, I need running water. I need some water, and I'd love to have a roof over my head and some clothing, right? And I need food. So I don't need a telephone, and I don't have to have a television. So I started, it got down to that for me. My bank account was dwindling big time, and I had no income at one point. And I had to figure out, what do I need just to live? Because it was getting right down to that serious. So now that the children of Israel and I and you, we've moved into this promise, we're living in the Spirit of God, we're living in Christ, we realize how much less we need in the physical sense. So we don't have to be extravagant in our spending. We don't have to have all the new shiny stuff. I mean, it's nice to have them, and there's nothing wrong with having nice things if you can afford that, but they're not necessities of life, right? So God says He humbled them and tested them to do good for them in the end. Otherwise, they might start getting arrogant and think that their own power and strength and their own abilities had done this and brought about this wealth. All right, so I don't know the main point I'm trying to make today, other than God is our provider. He's our keeper. Sometimes we go through hard, difficult, shaky times, But if we don't find ourselves humbled, and we don't stop and reevaluate what life really is, and what is necessity and what is extra, and what am I here for, if it doesn't shake us to ask these basic questions: who am I, whose am I, what am I here for, what am I supposed to be doing? If it doesn't give us those questions, then I'm afraid that maybe the testing hasn't really accomplished what maybe it needs to accomplish. So I'll just leave you with this. Take this time in your life. Every now and then, it's good to reevaluate these things. And don't ever think just because you're God's child that discipline can't come and that hard times might not happen. And sometimes it's not even about your disobedience. It's just because we live in a world that's fallen, and there's a lot of adverse effects from sin that we cause each other. All right, so I hope this has found you well, and I hope that maybe you'll take the time today to just think, you know what, thank you, Lord, for all that you've given me. Thank you for being my keeper, my provider, and I have learned the lesson from the desert, and now I'm safe to live in the promised land. All right, thank you for watching the Louie File. I will see you next time on the next installment.